Top 10 lists are something that the MMA community, especially on YouTube, loves to create. Whether it's the top 10 fighters of a certain weight class, the top 10 brawls of the year, the top 10 knockouts, top 10 submissions, or maybe even if you're getting a little crazy, the top 10 moments in Ultimate Fighter history, they're huge across the MMA YouTube community. We've already done one on the channel breaking down the top 10 prospects in MMA in 2022. But now we're going to do something a little different and turn back the clock. Top 10 list can be paired up with a decade of mixed martial arts action, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to look back from 2012 all the way up to the current point in 2022, and not just look at the best fights, the best knockouts, the best submissions, or the biggest and baddest brawls that have ever occurred. No, instead we're going to be looking at the top 10 upsets from 2012 to 2022. Now, you probably have your list and the cliche answers, and some of those will be included on the list, as you can see from the picture on your screen right now. But I've included a few surprising ones, and ones that I feel like maybe people won't agree with on this list, but that's what the comment section is for. So without any further ado, let's get this started. And for video purposes, I'll take the red corner, and you can get in the blue corner. And we can touch gloves in the center of the octagon and look at the top 10 times where the underdog reigns supreme. Up first on our list is going to be the battle between TJ Dillashaw and Renan Barão from May 24th, 2014 in the main event of UFC 173. Now, Dillashaw was stepping into this fight on relatively short notice, as the original title challenger was set to be Rafael Assunção going up against Barão for the championship. However, this would give Team Alpha Male and Coach Uriah Faber a chance to finally get gold under their training camp. The one thing that had eluded Team Alpha Male between knockout wins and impressive victories all in the same was getting that big gold strap under the premier mixed martial arts organization in the world. That was until Dillashaw stepped in to battle Renan Barão. Now, Barão was a huge favorite, and he was going into this fight on an over 30 fight unbeaten streak, going to defend his strap. And all in one night, things would change, and the fortune of Team Alpha Male would become a dream instead of a nightmare. Dillashaw would go on to perform in one of the best title-winning performances from a challenger in the history of professional mixed martial arts. He showcased some of the best and most elusive footwork since the likes of the bantamweight GOAT, in my opinion, in Dominic the Dominator Cruz, who he would eventually go on to battle later on in his career. Back and forth stance switches, changing angles, drop shifts, uppercuts, and same-side punch-kick combinations would go on to score Dillashaw a 5th round TKO over the long-reigning unbeaten contender and champion at the time in Barão. This would be the first championship win for Team Alpha Male, and would also be the arrival, or mark the arrival I should say, of Dillashaw atop the throne at 135 pounds. Now, they would go on to rematch later on in Chicago, Illinois on a UFC fight night, where Dillashaw would get the job done a second time, but quicker, with a TKO victory all in the same. And although the relationship atop Team Alpha Male between TJ Dillashaw, Uriah Faber, Danny Castillo, and the creator of Bang Muay Thai and Dwayne Bang Ludwig would eventually crumble, it still doesn't discount the historical relevance of this win for TJ Dillashaw, and why it's the first entry on our list of top 10 upsets of the decade. The next entry on our list is going to be the battle for the UFC Strawweight Championship between the longtime reigning defending Strawweight Queen in Joanna Jedrzejczyk, defending her title against top contender but also heavy underdog in Thug Rose Namajunas. This bout took place at UFC 217, which was only the second UFC event, or second premier mixed martial arts event, in New York City after MMA was legalized in the state, and then their first event took place at UFC 205, where McGregor reigned supreme and became the double champ, which is another piece of UFC history, but it's not on the list today. Joanna Jedrzejczyk versus Rosa Namajunas was, in many people's opinion, going to be the lamb led to the proverbial slaughter. It was going to be a sacrificial lamb in another win for the strawweight queen in the Boogie Woman, Joanna Jedrzejczyk. However, nobody told Pat Barry or Rosa Namajunas that these were the plans. And despite the champion in Jedrzejczyk being as high as a -5 to 700 favorite on most sports books, the fight would play out extremely different from those odds right from the start. Aside from a few feints and a brief combination punctuated with a low kick from the champion in Joanna, Namajunas would quickly close the distance and get the timing of the champion and land a beautiful overhand right as Joanna went to throw another kick. She dropped the champion and the crowd erupted alongside DC and Joe Rogan on commentary. Quickly, Joanna would get back up to her feet, but it would be a brief short moment before Joanna would get caught with another picture-perfect left hook from the challenger in Thug Rose Namajunas, which would make the arms go limp and drop the champion, finishing her off in the first round of the contest. DC and Rogan lost their minds on the commentary table, complimenting the astro-travelant Thug Rose, as she is now the new strawweight queen atop the division at 115 pounds. It was a huge moment and a beautiful post-fight speech from the now new champion in Namajunas, and another special yearbook-style moment for the UFC inside MSG. When Anthony Fluffy Hernandez took on Rodolfo the Black Belt Hunter Vieira at UFC 258 on February 13, 2021, many people believed he had little more than a puncher's chance going up against the multiple-time jiu-jitsu and grappling world champion in Vieira. The minute the fight got to the ground, people believed that all Vieira needed to do was get top position, control for a brief amount of time before he could lock up a submission and the fight would be over in the blink of an eye. And although the fight started trending in that direction right from the jump, Hernandez was able to survive any submission attempts that Vieira threw at him and eventually sucked the wind out of the much more muscular and built black belt Hunter. The stellar submission and takedown defense of Hernandez was showcased tenfold throughout that first round. And as Vieira's cardio started to fail him worse than we've ever seen in the octagon potentially, that's when Hernandez smelled blood and was able to go for the kill in the second round of the bout. After landing multiple striking combinations and punctuating some of them with a beautiful high kick which actually rocked Vieira, he almost locked up an anaconda choke, and it looked like the man who was supposed to get the submission early was going to have the Uno reverse card pulled on him and be submitted in his own right. And that's exactly what would go on to happen, as although the anaconda choke wasn't there for Fluffy, he would lock up the head and arm control in a sprawl position, move off to an angle, and shoot in for an arm-in guillotine and get the tap on the multiple-time jiu-jitsu world champion. This was the last and most unlikely outcome that anybody would have expected if Fluffy was able to get the victory in this bout. And if you go by the odds in the gambling sites and by the books, it was at a plus 3,000 underdog that Hernandez would win via submission, which means that a $100 bet on Hernandez with this method of victory would net you $3,000 in profit. And one of the biggest underdogs on the card won by the least likely method of victory, which is definitely an upset by any stretch of the imagination. Chris Weidman versus Anderson Silva in the main event of UFC 162 for the UFC middleweight title is one of the most monumental upsets in the history of mixed martial arts, and a day in the history of MMA and the UFC that changed the landscape of the sport forever. Anderson Silva went into the bout as the reigning, defending, undisputed UFC middleweight champion. One of the only UFC middleweight champions to ever be in the organization. He came into the bout with an unbeaten record spanning 2,457 days and came in as an over 2-1 favorite against the challenger in the undefeated at the time 8-0 Chris the All-American Weidman. Weidman was coming off of a TKO victory over Mark Munoz after countering him stepping in with an elbow over the top. But a lot of people discounted Weidman's chances, as they did with every challenger that stepped up to the Spider at this point. The aura of invincibility around Anderson Silva was one of the most magical things in MMA, but it would only take a special individual to be able to untangle themselves from the Spider's web and smash Silva in the jaws of defeat. Weidman came into the fight with an undeniable sense of confidence and started the bout off pretty well by taking down Anderson Silva and trying to land some good ground and pound. But you could see on the feet that Silva did not respect anything that Weidman had to offer, and that continued into the second round where Weidman was able to crack Silva with a left hook, but Silva pretended to rope-a-dope him a little bit and pretend to be hurt. However, after another brief exchange where Silva tried to lean back and pull away from the shots, Weidman was able to get Silva leaning back and step in with a left hook that cracked Silva right on the chin. And the over 2,000-day unbeaten streak and the middleweight title reign of one of the greatest middleweights of all time and greatest mixed martial artist of all time in Anderson Silva was done and dead to rights. Chris Weidman knocked out Anderson Silva in the second round at UFC 162 to become the new UFC middleweight champion and improve his impressive undefeated mixed martial arts record to 9 victories with no defeats. He would go on to battle Anderson Silva again in a rematch at UFC 168. However, Silva would get a kick checked and his leg would shatter, and that would be the first time we'd see any type of leg injury like that in some time inside the UFC. The conquering of Anderson the Spider Silva's unbeaten streak inside the UFC was one of the greatest days in the history of professional mixed martial arts, and one of the saddest days for most hardcore fans because many believed that Anderson Silva would never lose. The last time Anderson Silva lost prior to this loss to Weidman inside the UFC was on January 20th, 2006 in a disqualification to YoungQkm. However, as we know, every dog has their day, and on this day, the underdog reigned supreme in Chris the All-American Weidman as he became the new UFC middleweight champion. Here's an entry that I feel like some people are going to give me a lot of crap for in the comment section, and you know what? I'm here for it because I said we were going to think outside the box. At UFC 275 on June 11, 2022, the main event for the light heavyweight title pitted the longtime veteran and newly crowned UFC light heavyweight champion in Glover Teixeira up against the new contender, the Samurai, and the most dangerous man in that light heavyweight division in most people's opinions, and definitely the most creative and outside-the-box thinker when it comes to using every weapon in mixed martial arts, in Yuri Denisa Prochazka. Prochazka versus Teixeira was a fight that people believed there was no way it was going to go past 3 rounds, let alone go the distance. And although they were correct in one regard, the way that the fight played out was more insane than anybody ever could have imagined. If there was going to be a submission and grappling heavy offense in this fight, we knew that it was more than likely going to come from the champion in Glover Teixeira, who won the light heavyweight title after taking the back of Jan Blachowicz and submitting him in a huge upset at UFC 267. But against Yuri, we knew that he had good defensive grappling, but we knew that if Teixeira got on top of him on the ground, it was going to be a wrap no matter what. But Yuri came out in this fight and proved us all wrong by using good defense and surviving a lot of good scares on the mat in terms of ground and pound and possible submission attempts from the champion in Teixeira. On the feet, Prochazka had a lot of success using his awkward style and almost Dominic Cruz-esque footwork and stance changes to light up Teixeira when it came to the striking on the feet. But Teixeira also had his moments where he actually hurt Yuri Prochazka with an overhand right and a left hook behind it up against the cage, but shot in for a takedown in the 5th round when that probably wasn't the best idea, as he probably could have finished Prochazka in that moment. But at the end of the fight, in the 5th and final round, Teixeira was in a scramble with Prochazka and eventually gave up his back. And in that moment, Yuri was able to lock up a rear naked choke with no back hooks in from the backside control position and move off on an angle where Teixeira could no longer fight the hands. And a tap came within the last 60 seconds of the round, and the new light heavyweight champion was Yuri Denisa Prochazka, and he won with the most unlikely method of victory in terms of the matchup going into it. It was almost like the Anthony Hernandez and Rodolfo Vieira outcome that we talked about earlier on the list. But this was in much, much higher regard, with much more prestige on the line, as Prochazka became the new king atop the division at 205 pounds. Now, the rematch will take place next month at UFC 282, and will history repeat itself, and will we get another one of the greatest light heavyweight title fights aside from Jones and Gustafsson? Only time will tell, but Prochazka's submission over Teixeira definitely had to make the list. When Michael Bisping finally got a crack at the UFC middleweight title, it had been after 8 years with the promotion after starting back in 2008. However, after a brief main event shakeup about 3 weeks prior to the event, Michael Bisping would be called to fill in for the former champion in Chris Weidman in what was supposed to be the rematch with Rockhold after Rockhold defeated him for the title at UFC 194. The Count would get the call 17 days prior to the main event and have to cut filming short and start running in order to try to see what shape he was in going into his first crack at UFC Gold since debuting in the promotion. But there's no way that Bisping could have said no, even if in his mind he thought maybe there was no way he was going to win this fight, and this was just the ideal situation for him after everything he's been through with the promotion to get a title shot on this short of notice. But Coach Jason Parillo talked some sense into Michael Bisping and said that he was in shape and he knew without a shadow of a doubt that the Count could reign supreme and claim gold by beating the man who had already beat him once before in Rockhold. And not only defeated him, but defeated him in a dominating fashion after dropping him with a head kick and then submitting him with a one-arm mounted guillotine. However, whether it was ideal or not, the last man that was ever going to turn down a fight was going to be Michael the Count Bisping, and he never did it before in his career, and he wasn't going to start now. So Bisping came into the fight as a huge, hefty underdog, and although I don't have the odds pulled up right now, I'm sure if you Google it, you can find it yourself. And although Bisping was being counted out by just about everybody in the MMA community and fans alike, the last person who was going to doubt himself was going to be Michael the Count Bisping. And whether Rockhold could conceive, believe, and achieve that he was going to have a successful title defense here, Bisping would have different plans. He would come into the bout and see that Rockhold was extremely overconfident and cocky in the way that he portrayed his striking on the feet. Very lazy jabs and a lack of defense, mainly relying on head movement with his chin straight up in the air. And the defensive flaws of Rockhold would be exploited later on in the bout, as Rockhold would get caught with a right hook to the body and Bisping's famous left hook over the lead shoulder, which would drop Rockhold and set up the finishing sequence. As Rockhold would try to get back up to his feet and gain his wits about him, Rockhold would get caught with another overhand left as Bisping switched to southpaw up against the cage and be knocked unconscious. And now, the prophecy of Michael Bisping's MMA career was finally fulfilled. After nearly a decade in the premier mixed martial arts organization in the world, he finally got a crack at the 185-pound strap. And he finally had the chance to claim gold. The Count was now the champion, and following this win, he would also be able to avenge his most brutal loss in that knockout loss to Dan Henderson at UFC 100 with a unanimous decision victory and his first successful title defense at UFC 204 in his hometown of London, England. And that is the true definition of a career-defining moment for the Count Michael Bisping inside the UFC. When Dominic Cruz took on the new top contender in Cody "No Love" Garbrandt for his bantamweight championship, many people believed that even though this was a good fight on paper, there was no chance that the over-aggressive Garbrandt was going to be able to hit the Magic Man and elusive Dominic the Dominator Cruz. He had spent a career making people look like idiots, using his lateral movement, darts, in and out styles of footwork, and hip bumps to make people swing at air for the entirety of the fight, including former and current teammates of Cody Garbrandt in TJ Dillashaw and coach Uriah Faber. Dominic Cruz was coming off of that title defense against Faber at UFC 199, and going into this fight, many people gave Garbrandt little to no chance due to his over-aggressive striking style and the fact that he loaded up on a lot of shots. The speed was more than likely going to give Cruz some issues at some point, but people believed you can't hit what you can't catch, and Dominic was going to outclass and outpoint Garbrandt, potentially even getting a finish later on in the 4th and 5th rounds of the championship bout. However, what was to come and what everybody was able to see was one of the most masterful performances from a challenger, aside from the bout which we talked about earlier in TJ Dillashaw versus Renan Barão 1. Dominic Cruz got cut off at the pass by Garbrandt at any chance he got, and the multiple punch boxing combinations of Garbrandt and the speed that he possessed in those combinations caused Cruz a lot more trouble than he ever expected to be in when the fight took place. And whenever Cruz tried to step into range, he either got cracked on the chin with the fast combinations of Garbrandt or got his hips timed and was taken down by No Love all in the same. And although Garbrandt did have some huge success early on in the fight, even dropping Cruz multiple times throughout the championship bout, Cruz did come back strong and probably win the 4th and the 5th. However, it wasn't enough, and the underdog in the Team Alpha Male standout and newcomer to the UFC in Cody No Love Garbrandt was not only the first man to ever hand Dominic Cruz a defeat in his UFC career, and not only the man to finally defeat Dominic Cruz in the 135-pound bantamweight division, but he was now the new bantamweight champion and the second UFC champion under the Team Alpha Male training camp and coach Uriah Faber. This was a huge win and such a masterful performance from Cody, but even though it was his greatest performance, he never would live up to the potential again following this win, aside from a brief knockout over Rafael Assunção. But the performance was masterful, the technique and defense was legendary, and there's no chance we couldn't put it on the list. Going into the co-main event of UFC 269, Amanda Nunes, or the Lioness, was known as the most invincible fighter on the entire UFC roster. No woman seemed to be a match for her at this point in her career, aside from the champ at 125 pounds in Valentina the Bullet Shevchenko, who she held not one but 2 victories over. But going into her fight against the Venezuelan vixen in Juliana Pena, many people believed that this was just going to be another classic Amanda Nunes performance where she was going to run right through the opponent and probably get a first round finish. However, going into the bout, Pena had an incredible self-belief and knew that as long as she didn't back down to the bully of 135 pounds in the champion Nunes, she would probably be able to make something happen and rewrite history by shocking the world. And that's exactly what Pena would do, as despite having a pretty rough first round, she would continue to walk forward and land some good jabs in the face of Nunes, constantly stabbing her right in the bridge of the nose with the jab, and that being able to nullify a lot of the power that was possessed in the right hand or the left hook of the champion and the Lioness Amanda Nunes. And once the queen of women's MMA realized that she wasn't going to be able to bully this challenger like she had so many in the past, we saw the cardio and doubt start to creep into the mind of Nunes as she started to wilt minute by minute and second by second. Later on in the second round, Nunes would get rocked with a beautiful right hand from Juliana Pena, a jab behind it, and she would pour on the pressure more than Nunes had ever had the pressure poured on her before, punctuating it with a body lock takedown and being able to sink in not even the full hooks, but take the back and get the rear naked choke. No full hooks in, kind of like the Prohaska and Teixeira finish we talked about earlier, and she was able to get the tap and beat the conqueror of women's MMA, beat the beast and the queen of women's MMA for the past 4, 5, or 6 years. And this was the biggest win in the career of the Venezuelan vixen Juliana Pena, and cemented her name in the history books as being part of one of the biggest upsets in women's MMA history. I guess we could call this next entry the Miracle in Melbourne. Just passing up on the recent 7-year anniversary of this bout, Holly Holm would shock the world against the reigning, defending, undisputed, dominant queen of women's MMA at the time in Rowdy Ronda Rousey. Not only was she the inaugural women's champion, inaugural UFC women's bantamweight champion in the UFC after she defeated Liz Carmouche, but she was also a heavy favorite in every single one of her fights. And the more fights that she competed in, and the more times she defended her title, she was able to showcase not only her world-class judo and the famous armbar, but improvements in her striking game and her boxing especially. However, going up against a multiple-time welterweight champion in boxing in the preacher's daughter Holly Holm, most people knew that if the fight stayed within striking range, and more importantly stayed within boxing distance, Ronda Rousey's boxing technique and fundamentals were going to be exposed against the preacher's daughter. And that's exactly what would go on to happen. We called this the Miracle in Melbourne for a reason. Holly Holm was able to dictate the distance and the pace and keep the right outside foot on the lead left foot of the orthodox fighter in Rousey, constantly avoiding takedown attempts and potential judo throws and keeping it at a distance where Holm wanted to be. She was eventually able to continue to sting Ronda Rousey with that straight left hand and pivot off to the lead side on an angle over and over and over again, even having Ronda Rousey swing a wild left hook and knock herself off balance as Holm was able to slip and roll underneath and cruise her way back to the center of the octagon. After another straight left hand rocked Ronda Rousey, Holly Holm was able to get that lead outside foot and bang a left high kick right off the jaw of Rousey, knocking her unconscious. After a few more ground and pound shots, the preacher's daughter was now the new UFC women's bantamweight champion, and she would put the pioneer of women's MMA to rest in one of the biggest upsets in MMA history. When the notorious Conor McGregor took on Nate Diaz in the UFC 196 main event, Diaz only had about a week and a half to prepare after the original main event was supposed to be McGregor versus Rafael Dos Anjos for the UFC lightweight title. However, after the champion in Dos Anjos would suffer from a broken foot, he would have to withdraw from the bout. And even though it was on short notice, the UFC wanted to give the fans the best bang for their buck at the current point. And although it could have maybe been a potential bout against Frankie Edgar, the UFC went with fan favorite and entertaining and outspoken Nate Diaz. It was going to be Nate Diaz versus Conor McGregor, but it wasn't going to be at 155 pounds. Even though that was both men's, I would say, natural weight class, the bout would take place at 170 pounds in the welterweight division. This was a little bit taboo and kind of unbelievable at this point because nobody believed that McGregor would fight at 170 pounds. He may have talked about it in the lead up to this bout and said that he wanted to go up and try to take the belt from the then champion in Tyron Woodley, but we never thought he was actually going to do it. And although Diaz was a fan favorite in the community's eyes, many people believed that this was again going to be a lamb led to the proverbial slaughter, which seems to have been a big storyline in a lot of the bouts in Nate Diaz's career, where he had upset the majority and satisfied the minority. McGregor would start off fast and strong, which seemed to be the case in a lot of Nate Diaz's bouts against other opponents, where he would get beat in the beginning and then have to overcome adversity and put on that pace and the pressure. And although the notorious one was the current UFC featherweight champion at the time after knocking out Jose Aldo at UFC 194 in 13 seconds, what would go on to take place in this bout would change the landscape of MMA and the landscape of the notorious Conor McGregor's career for the foreseeable future. McGregor would start out fast and strong in this main event and continue to connect on the chin of Nate Diaz, even busting open the eyes of Diaz early on in the bout. The straight left was connecting over and over, the right body shots, the spinning hook kicks, and even a takedown reversal from McGregor started the bout out in his favor right from the get-go. However, as we've come to learn with the Stockton Gangster, you can never count Nate Diaz out of a fight. And as we saw Conor McGregor's gas tank continuing to be sucked down and his head movement and in and out movement start to slow, Nate Diaz would land a 1-2, his signature 1-2 I should say, right on the chin of McGregor and cause him to pause in the action and wobble for a brief second. At that point, Nate Diaz would point to McGregor and laugh at him as if to say, "I know I've got you and it's only a matter of time before I put you out." As Diaz smelled blood, he would pour on the pressure, causing McGregor to panic shoot after getting hit with multiple shots on the feet. He would shoot in and Nate Diaz would go for the patented guillotine, but McGregor would roll out of it. But he would roll right into the mount and Nate Diaz would eventually start to land his ground and pound shots. As McGregor tried to shrimp his hips out and get out into half guard, Nate Diaz would eventually take the back of McGregor and sink in the rear naked choke, getting the tap shortly after and causing the MMA world to burn right under his fingertips. A second round rear naked choke submission would hand McGregor his first loss inside the UFC, and it would give Nate Diaz a victory over a champion at the current point, even though it was in a weight class below the one they were fighting in currently and the weight class that Nate Diaz competed in at 155 pounds. After McGregor would be defeated, the MMA world would go ablaze, just like Diaz would set those joints ablaze when he would spark one up in victory or defeat. The two would go on to rematch in the main event of UFC 202 in one of the most eagerly anticipated rematches in the company's history. Conor McGregor would go on to avenge the loss to Diaz in a 5-round unanimous decision victory in a war that was back and forth for the entirety of the bout from start to finish. This bout and Nate Diaz's submission victory over Conor McGregor ranks up there amongst the biggest upsets in MMA history, and not only just in the decade. And that is why the UFC 196 bout, an upset all-in-one, had to close out our list for the top 10 upsets in UFC history of the decade. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to hit a Kimura on the like button and a triangle choke on the subscribe button, and maybe even flip the double bird to the notification bell so you can be updated on any and all uploads to the best mixed martial arts YouTube channel on the platform. Thank you guys for listening and stay blessed.